The Iraq War, which began in 2003, can trace its origins to a complex interplay of historical, political, and geopolitical factors. To fully understand why the United States and its allies initiated military action against Iraq, it is essential to examine the context that developed in the years following the Gulf War, the global political climate after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, and the role of Saddam Hussein's regime in shaping the narrative that justified the invasion. The Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 marked a turning point in Iraq's relationship with the international community. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait prompted a swift and forceful response from a U.S.-led coalition, culminating in the liberation of Kuwait. However, the war did not result in the removal of Saddam Hussein from power, leaving his regime intact but weakened. Economic sanctions imposed by the United Nations aimed to pressure Iraq into compliance with disarmament resolutions, particularly regarding its chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. These sanctions devastated Iraq's economy, leading to widespread poverty and suffering among the Iraqi population, while Saddam's regime remained entrenched. Over time, the sanctions also became a source of international controversy, with critics arguing that they disproportionately harmed ordinary Iraqis rather than the ruling elite. Throughout the 1990s, the United States and its allies maintained a policy of containment toward Iraq. This policy included no-fly zones enforced by U.S. and British aircraft to protect Kurdish and Shiite populations from government attacks, as well as regular inspections by the United Nations Special Commission, UNSCOM, to ensure the dismantling of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, capabilities. However, tensions between Iraq and the international community escalated when Saddam's government began obstructing UN inspections, leading to accusations that Iraq was concealing WMDs. These suspicions were bolstered by Saddam's history of using chemical weapons against both Iran during the Iran-Iraq War and against his own people, notably in the 1988 Halabja massacre. The issue of WMDs became central to the narrative surrounding Iraq in the late 1990s and early 2000s. While Iraq consistently denied possessing such weapons, its lack of transparency fueled international skepticism. The U.S. and British governments, in particular, were convinced that Saddam's regime posed a significant threat to regional and global security. This belief was reinforced by intelligence reports, some of which later proved to be flawed or exaggerated, suggesting that Iraq had resumed its WMD programs. Saddam's defiance of UN resolutions and his confrontational rhetoric further cemented his image as a destabilizing force in the Middle East. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 fundamentally altered the global political landscape and the United States' approach to foreign policy. The attacks, carried out by al-Qaeda, revealed vulnerabilities in U.S. security and sparked a determination to combat terrorism on a global scale. President George W. Bush's administration adopted a doctrine of preemption, asserting that the United States had the right to act against potential threats before they fully materialized. This doctrine was articulated in the National Security Strategy of 2002, which emphasized the need to address the nexus of rogue states, terrorism, and WMDs. In this context, Iraq emerged as a focal point of U.S. concerns. Although no evidence linked Saddam Hussein directly to the 9/11 attacks, his regime was viewed as a potential enabler of terrorism due to its hostility toward the United States and its alleged possession of WMDs. The Bush administration argued that the risk of Saddam providing such weapons to terrorist groups was too great to ignore. This argument gained traction among U.S. policymakers and the public, who were still reeling from the trauma of 9/11 and wary of future attacks. The case for military action against Iraq was presented to the international community as a necessity to enforce UN resolutions and eliminate the threat posed by Saddam's regime. In a speech before the United Nations in September 2002, President Bush outlined the U.S. position, emphasizing Iraq's violations of its disarmament obligations and calling for decisive action. The administration also sought to portray the invasion as a moral imperative, highlighting Saddam's brutal human rights record and the suffering of the Iraqi people under his rule. Despite these arguments, the prospect of war was met with significant opposition, both domestically and internationally. Many questioned the reliability of the intelligence used to justify the invasion, as well as the legality of preemptive military action under international law. France, Germany, and Russia, among other nations, expressed strong reservations about the use of force, advocating for continued inspections and diplomatic efforts. Massive protests against the war erupted in cities around the world, reflecting widespread skepticism and fear of the potential consequences of a military intervention in Iraq. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Bush administration intensified its efforts to build a coalition and secure support for military action. Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council in February 2003 sought to provide a comprehensive case against Iraq, including satellite images, intercepted communications, and testimony from defectors. While Powell's presentation convinced some, it failed to sway many key international actors. Ultimately, the U.S. and its closest allies, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland, opted to proceed without explicit UN authorization, citing Iraq's continued non-compliance with existing resolutions as justification. The decision to invade Iraq in March 2003 was shaped by a combination of strategic calculations, ideological convictions, and domestic political pressures. For the Bush administration, the war was an opportunity to assert American leadership in a post-9/11 world and to demonstrate the effectiveness of its preemptive security doctrine. The removal of Saddam Hussein was also seen as a chance to reshape the Middle East, promoting democracy and stability in a region long plagued by authoritarianism and conflict. However, critics argued that the administration underestimated the complexity of the situation in Iraq and the potential for unintended consequences. As the war loomed, Saddam Hussein's actions continued to fuel uncertainty. His regime maintained a posture of defiance, refusing to fully cooperate with UN inspectors and issuing bellicose statements. At the same time, there were signs that Saddam sought to avoid conflict, including back-channel communications and offers to negotiate. However, these overtures were largely dismissed by the U.S. and its allies, who were determined to act decisively. The origins of the Iraq War reveal a tangled web of motivations, miscalculations, and conflicting narratives. While the invasion was framed as a response to an urgent security threat, it was also deeply influenced by the broader geopolitical ambitions of the United States and the legacy of its contentious relationship with Saddam Hussein's regime. As the world braced for war, the stage was set for a conflict that would have profound and far-reaching consequences for Iraq, the region, and the international community. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 marked the beginning of a military campaign that would have lasting consequences for Iraq, the Middle East, and global geopolitics. On March 20th, U.S.-led coalition forces launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, with the stated goals of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, toppling Saddam Hussein's regime, and establishing a foundation for democracy in Iraq. The invasion unfolded swiftly, with coalition forces advancing toward Baghdad and dismantling Iraq's military infrastructure in a matter of weeks. However, the rapid initial success of the campaign soon gave way to a prolonged and chaotic occupation that underscored the complexities of achieving stability in a deeply divided nation. The military strategy employed during the invasion reflected overwhelming technological and logistical superiority. Coalition forces, led primarily by the United States and the United Kingdom, deployed state-of-the-art weaponry and utilized a combination of airstrikes, armored advances, and special operations to neutralize Iraqi resistance. Within 3 weeks of the initial assault, coalition troops entered Baghdad, encountering only sporadic resistance as they advanced. The collapse of Saddam's government was symbolized by the dramatic toppling of his statue in Firdos Square, an image that quickly circulated around the world as a symbol of the regime's downfall. While the initial invasion achieved its immediate objective of removing Saddam from power, it also exposed the fragility of Iraq's social and political structures. The Ba'athist regime, which had ruled Iraq for decades, had centralized authority to such an extent that its collapse left a profound power vacuum. Iraq's military and civil institutions were largely dismantled in the aftermath of the invasion, particularly through the controversial policy of de-Ba'athification, which barred former Ba'ath party members from holding public office. This decision alienated large segments of the Sunni population, who were disproportionately represented among the Ba'athists, and fueled resentment toward the coalition forces and the new Iraqi administration. Compounding these challenges was the disbandment of the Iraqi army, a move that left hundreds of thousands of armed and trained personnel unemployed and without a clear role in post-Saddam Iraq. Many of these individuals became involved in insurgent activities, contributing to the rise of armed resistance against the occupation. This decision, which was intended to prevent a resurgence of Ba'athist influence, instead had the unintended consequence of intensifying the security crisis in Iraq. As the occupation progressed, the absence of WMDs, one of the primary justifications for the invasion, became increasingly apparent, eroding the credibility of the coalition's rationale for the war. This revelation, coupled with the lack of a coherent post-war strategy, led to growing criticism of the occupation both domestically and internationally. The Bush administration faced accusations of failing to adequately plan for the challenges of rebuilding Iraq and underestimating the complexities of governing a nation with deep sectarian and ethnic divisions. The insurgency that emerged in the aftermath of the invasion quickly became one of the most significant obstacles to stabilizing Iraq. This insurgency was fueled by a combination of factors, including resentment toward the coalition forces, opposition to the new political order, and long-standing sectarian tensions. Sunni Arabs, who had dominated Iraq's political landscape under Saddam, felt marginalized by the Shiite-led government that emerged after his removal. This sense of exclusion contributed to the radicalization of many Sunnis, who joined insurgent groups such as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. These groups carried out a campaign of violence that targeted coalition forces, Iraqi security personnel, and civilians, further destabilizing the country. Sectarian violence became a defining feature of post-invasion Iraq, with tensions between Sunni and Shiite communities escalating into full-scale conflict. The bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra in 2006, a revered Shiite shrine, marked a turning point in this sectarian strife, triggering a wave of retaliatory attacks and intensifying the cycle of violence. The fragmentation of Iraqi society along sectarian lines undermined efforts to build a unified and stable government, as political factions often prioritize their own interests over national reconciliation. Amid this turmoil, the role of external actors further complicated the situation. Iran, in particular, sought to expand its influence in Iraq by supporting Shiite militias and political groups. This intervention was motivated by both strategic and ideological considerations, as Iran sought to counterbalance the presence of U.S. forces in the region and promote its vision of a Shiite-led political order. Conversely, neighboring Sunni-majority states, such as Saudi Arabia, were alarmed by the prospect of increased Iranian influence and provided support to Sunni insurgents. These dynamics contributed to the regionalization of the conflict, with Iraq becoming a battleground for competing interests. Efforts to rebuild Iraq and establish a functional government were hampered by widespread corruption, inadequate infrastructure, and the lack of a cohesive national identity. The Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, led by U.S. Administrator Paul Bremer, faced criticism for its handling of the occupation, particularly its failure to address Iraq's economic and social challenges effectively. Reconstruction projects were often plagued by mismanagement and inefficiency, further alienating Iraqis who were already disillusioned with the coalition's presence. Despite these challenges, there were some milestones in Iraq's political transition, including the drafting of a new constitution and the holding of parliamentary elections in 2005. These developments represented steps toward establishing a democratic framework, but they were overshadowed by ongoing violence and the deep divisions within Iraqi society. The elections themselves highlighted the sectarian polarization of Iraqi politics, as voters largely aligned with parties representing their ethnic or religious communities. The U.S. military's approach to counterinsurgency evolved over time, culminating in the implementation of the Surge strategy in 2007. This strategy, which involved deploying additional troops and adopting a more community-focused approach, sought to reduce violence and create the conditions for political reconciliation. The surge achieved some success in curbing sectarian violence and weakening insurgent groups, particularly Al-Qaeda in Iraq. However, these gains were fragile and dependent on the continued presence of U.S. forces. As the years passed, the strain of the Iraq War became increasingly evident in the United States. The human and financial costs of the conflict, combined with the lack of clear progress toward a stable and democratic Iraq, led to growing public discontent and calls for a reevaluation of U.S. policy. The war also had a profound impact on the broader geopolitical landscape, contributing to a decline in U.S. credibility and influence in the Middle East and shaping perceptions of American foreign policy around the world. By the end of the second decade of the conflict, Iraq remained deeply fragmented and unstable. While the immediate goals of the invasion had been achieved, Saddam Hussein was removed from power, and the Ba'athist regime was dismantled. The broader objectives of establishing democracy and stability in Iraq proved elusive. The invasion and occupation of Iraq underscored the challenges of nation-building and highlighted the complexities of intervening in a region marked by deep-seated divisions and historical grievances. As Iraq continued to grapple with the legacy of the war, the impact of the conflict reverberated far beyond its borders, shaping the dynamics of the Middle East and influencing debates about the use of military force in addressing global challenges. The aftermath of the Iraq War presented an array of challenges that underscored the difficulty of rebuilding a nation fractured by war, sectarian violence, and decades of authoritarian rule. With Saddam Hussein removed from power, Iraq faced the monumental task of reconstructing its political institutions, reviving its economy, and healing its deeply divided society. These efforts were complicated by ongoing instability, regional interference, and the legacy of decisions made during the U.S.-led occupation. The quest for stability in Iraq would become a protracted and often tumultuous process, reflecting the complexities of addressing both internal and external pressures in a volatile region. In the immediate post-war period, the Coalition Provisional Authority (CPA) attempted to lay the groundwork for Iraq's political transition. The CPA oversaw the drafting of a new constitution and the establishment of interim governing bodies, with the ultimate goal of creating a democratic framework. However, these efforts were marred by the exclusionary policies of de-Baathification and the disbandment of the Iraqi army, which alienated large segments of the population and contributed to the rise of insurgent movements. Sunni Arabs, in particular, felt marginalized in the new political order, while Shiite and Kurdish factions vied for power in the emerging government. This lack of inclusivity undermined the legitimacy of Iraq's nascent institutions and fueled sectarian tensions. The sectarian divide, exacerbated by the legacy of Saddam's rule and the policies of the occupation, became one of the most significant obstacles to Iraq's stability. Shiite-dominated governments that emerged after the fall of Saddam were often accused of pursuing policies that favored their own communities at the expense of Sunnis, who increasingly felt disenfranchised. The polarization of Iraqi politics was mirrored in society, where sectarian militias and extremist groups carried out campaigns of violence that deepened mistrust and fear among communities. The bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in 2006 and the subsequent escalation of sectarian violence highlighted the fragility of Iraq's social fabric and the difficulty of achieving reconciliation. Efforts to rebuild Iraq's economy were similarly fraught with challenges. Decades of war, sanctions, and mismanagement had left the country's infrastructure in ruins, and the conflict further exacerbated these problems. While Iraq possessed substantial oil reserves, corruption and inefficiencies hindered the effective use of these resources for reconstruction. The oil sector, which accounted for the majority of Iraq's revenue, was often targeted by insurgent attacks, further disrupting production and exports. At the same time, widespread unemployment and poverty created fertile ground for discontent and extremism, complicating efforts to stabilize the country. Despite these difficulties, there were moments of progress. Iraq's parliamentary elections in 2005 marked a significant step toward establishing a democratic framework, with millions of Iraqis participating in the political process despite ongoing violence. The drafting of a new constitution, while contentious, provided a foundation for governance, albeit one that reflected the deep divisions within Iraqi society. The U.S. military's surge strategy in 2007, which involved the deployment of additional troops and a focus on counterinsurgency, succeeded in reducing violence and weakening insurgent groups, at least temporarily. These developments created a window of opportunity for Iraq to pursue political reconciliation and rebuild its institutions. However, the progress achieved during this period was often undermined by the persistence of corruption, weak governance, and external interference. Iraq's political system, based on a power-sharing arrangement among its various ethnic and sectarian groups, often led to gridlock and inefficiency. Rivalries between political factions and the influence of foreign actors, particularly Iran, further complicated decision-making and hindered efforts to address the country's pressing challenges. While Iraq made some strides in rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, the benefits of these efforts were unevenly distributed, exacerbating inequalities and fueling resentment. The withdrawal of U.S. combat troops in 2011 marked a turning point in Iraq's post-war trajectory. While the withdrawal was seen by many as a necessary step toward restoring Iraqi sovereignty, it also left the country vulnerable to renewed instability. The Iraqi government, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, struggled to maintain security and address the grievances of its citizens. Maliki's increasingly authoritarian tendencies and his marginalization of Sunni communities contributed to the resurgence of sectarian tensions and the reemergence of extremist groups. The rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, in 2014 represented a dramatic escalation of the challenges facing Iraq. Exploiting the power vacuum created by the Syrian civil war and the weaknesses of Iraq's security forces, ISIS rapidly gained control of large swathes of territory, including the major city of Mosul. The group's brutal tactics and extremist ideology posed a direct threat to Iraq's stability and to the broader region. The Iraqi government, with the support of an international coalition led by the United States, launched a military campaign to defeat ISIS, which culminated in the group's territorial defeat in 2017. However, the destruction caused by the conflict with ISIS, combined with the underlying issues that had allowed the group to rise, left Iraq facing a long and difficult road to recovery. In the years following the defeat of ISIS, Iraq has continued to grapple with the legacies of war and occupation. Efforts to rebuild cities devastated by the conflict, such as Mosul, have been slow and uneven, leaving many communities struggling to recover. The displacement of millions of Iraqis during the conflict has created a humanitarian crisis, with many still unable to return to their homes. At the same time, the political and economic challenges that have plagued Iraq since 2003 remain largely unresolved. Corruption remains a pervasive issue, undermining public trust in the government and hindering the delivery of basic services. Protests against corruption, unemployment, and poor governance have become a recurring feature of Iraqi political life, reflecting widespread frustration among the population. These protests, which often draw participants from across Iraq's diverse communities, underscore the growing demand for accountability and reform. Iraq's relationship with its neighbors and the broader international community continues to shape its quest for stability. Iran's influence in Iraq, particularly through its support for Shiite militias and political factions, remains a contentious issue, both domestically and internationally. At the same time, Iraq has sought to balance its relationships with other regional powers, such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, as well as with the United States. Navigating these relationships while preserving its sovereignty has been a delicate and ongoing challenge for Iraq's leaders. Despite these obstacles, Iraq's future is not without hope. The resilience of its people, as demonstrated by their participation in elections and their demands for reform, reflects a desire for a better future. Civil society organizations and grassroots movements have played a key role in advocating for accountability and promoting social cohesion. Additionally, Iraq's oil wealth, if managed effectively, has the potential to provide the resources needed for reconstruction and development. The legacy of the Iraq War continues to loom large over the country and the region. The conflict not only reshaped Iraq's political landscape, but also had far-reaching implications for the Middle East and for U.S. foreign policy. The war highlighted the limitations of military intervention as a tool for nation-building and underscored the importance of addressing the underlying causes of instability. For Iraq, the road to stability and prosperity remains fraught with challenges, but the determination of its people and the lessons learned from the past offer a foundation for hope and progress.